Loot boxes, packs, supply crates, wishes, though they all have different names, functionally they're all the same. Now in case you don't know what I'm talking about, loot crates are virtual treasure chests. They can contain new characters, alternative costumes or weapons, and are usually an additional purchase within the game costing real money from you the player. Honestly, I'd be pretty surprised if you hadn't encountered them in some fashion. According to a study by academics at the University of York between the years 2010 and 2019, the presence of microtransactions in the top games on Steam has increased from 4 to 71%. But what exactly is the appeal of these digital treasure troves? Where do they originate from? And has their popularity contributed to more than just in-game sales? While sources can't seem to agree on the originator of loot boxes, many speculate them to be an offshoot or spiritual successor to trading card game booster packs. While the exact progenitor of loot boxes may remain a mystery, many agree their first major implementation was in ZT Online, a popular Chinese MMO in the mid-2000s. In fact, the book Redwire, China's Internet Revolution, lauded praise on ZT Online for their use and may have been the first source to classify the feature. And in fairness, it was actually an extremely intelligent move on the part of developer Giant Network Games, at least according to Daniel Ahmed, an analyst with video game market research Nico Partners.
Players weren't able to buy top-end PCs. They weren't able to afford these $50 or $60 games, and that's why internet cafes were huge back then. Piracy was also huge back in the day, and the way around this is to release a game for free.
This move to a free-to-play model and offering additional content alleviated the initial cost of players while also availing ZT Online a revenue source despite many people decrying the ethics. In fact, Play No Evil once called ZT Online the crack house of free-to-play gaming, and EVE Online meets Las Vegas. Now, despite the game's perception, ZT Online performed incredibly well. In fact, in the same report, Play No Evil noted that even with them reducing in-game purchases and seeing a large fall in revenue, it still performed as well financially as Blizzard's World of Warcraft in 2008. And it didn't take long for many other developers in Asian territories to replicate the business model of ZT Online, causing a large influx of games with similar systems to take hold of the market. In fact, this boom created a whole new genre known as Gatcha, short for Gachapon, a capsule toy that is popular in Hong Kong and Japan. And this led to a lot of notable success. For example, Puzzle and Dragons, a mobile game which was the first of its kind to reach $1 billion and contributed 91% of developers' gung-ho sales in 2013 as seen in their financial reports. This concept also proved really beneficial to smaller game devs or IPs that may not have had the ability to compete with other major releases for standard retail prices. Being free to play opens the game to a much more willing player base, and the promise of continued free support being funded by in-game purchases is alluring to say the least. And the formula still sees success in games like Warframe or even Splitgate most recently. But what about in the West? Well, it seems almost video game tradition for the West to eventually copy the East, and all too soon, loot boxes started to make their way west. In 2010, Dean Takashi of VentureBeat reported that the social media game Farmville had generated $235 million in the first quarter of the year. The surprising thing though is that the user base for Farmville had actually taken a hit, with monthly users dropping from 83 to 39 million that spring. While there was no concrete evidence of what percentage of the player base was investing into the game, speculation put it around 1 to 3% of players, which is Takeshi notes,
"It's interesting that this amount of revenue from 1 to 3% of Zynga's players is enough to pay for the cost of all others and then generate some profit for Zynga."
Not only was a small percentage of the player base engaging in the marketplace for the game, but ad revenue only comprised 9.9 million of the aforementioned 235. In fact, Zynga saw such little return from their ads that they actually began to reduce in-game adverts in order to improve user experience. Now, while Zynga wasn't a loot box driven game, it's important to know the success was noticed by a plethora of video game developers, including EA. In an Edge magazine interview a whole month before Takeshi's report, Ben Cousins, then general manager of free-to-play gaming at EA, echoed Zynga's lack of faith in in-game adverts.
"We actually aren't getting much from ad revenue at all. The in-game advertising business hasn't grown as fast as people expected it to. We hedge our bets. We thought we'd do some in-game advertising and virtual goods sales, and one of those really took off fast. The other really hasn't taken off at all."
It's important to know that the game in question Cousins is referring to is the mobile game Battlefield Heroes. In fact, EA was one of the earliest adopters of the loot box model. In 2010, FIFA's Ultimate Team mode went from being paid DLC to an included feature in the game. Player packs were introduced in order to recomp the cost of the additional feature, and Ultimate Team, or FUT, has acted as such in all EA Sport games since then. And at the time, the feature was received rather well. As Game Radar's Aaron Thomas puts it, "If
you're on the fence with the Ultimate Team downloadable content, you can create a team and play 5 games at no cost, but once you start, it's unlikely you'll be able to turn back.
And it wasn't just EA taking a page out of the Gatcha handbook. A year later, Valve would follow suit with Team Fortress 2 seeing the addition of supply crates, and not long after going free to play in 2010. This turned out to be an extremely lateral move for the founders of Steam, and a clear callback to the business model employed by ZT Online 4 years prior. According to Gabe Newell, the move to free to play saw the user base for TF2 increase by a factor of 5. But more surprisingly was the amount of players who partook in purchasing supply crates.
We see a 20 to 30% conversion rate of people who are playing those games who buy something, much higher than the 2 to 3% conversion rate seen by other free-to-play games.
With this, the loot box model had proven itself, and it wasn't long before Valve introduced a similar system to their competitive FPS, Counter-Strike Global Offensive. MMOs like Star Trek Online began to abandon the subscription-based models that were the norm for MMOs, opting for a free-to-play model and covering the cost of the game, maintenance, and additional content through microtransactions. The loot box formula was now in full swing and showed no sign of stopping. According to an article by GameIndustry.biz, by 2017, EA's Ultimate Team business model was generating $800 million annually. But this wasn't something that could last. Cracks had begun to show. By 2012, EA had successfully implemented the Ultimate Team across their plethora of sports titles, making them a bit bold and seeing where else they could implement similar systems. Their first implementation outside of a sports game was in the blockbuster Mass Effect 3. However, Mass Effect's director Casey Hudson was heavily involved in its implementation, and it was only regulated solely to the game's multiplayer. While Hudson left BioWare before the launch of Mass Effect 3, the critical and EA's opinion was that the project had been a success, prompting them to launch the loot box model on a much grander scale. According to then EA CFO Blake Jorgensen, "We're building into all of our games the ability to pay for things along the way, either to get to a higher level, to buy a new character, to buy a truck, a gun, whatever it might be, and consumers are enjoying and embracing that way of the business." Less than a year later, however, the company released Dead Space 3, what is now the final chapter in their much celebrated survival horror series, and according to a post-earning fiscal call, the game had underperformed by any of their expectations. While no direct reason was given in regards to the game's inherent failure, speculators such as then Destructoid's Jim Sterling pointed to EA's liberal use of microtransactions in a predominantly single-player game as to maybe why it failed. It's telling as well that since Dead Space 3, there have been no new original entries in the series, and EA would later go on to catch more bad press for their loot box models in Star Wars Battlefront 2. Many players decried it as yet another case of play to win gone mad.
Even when beta testing, players were upset with how the game used loot boxes. Users were required to spend real-world money in order to make any significant progress in-game. Even though the game cost $60, purchasing loot boxes with real money was the only real option if players wanted to stay ahead of their online competition.
2017 also saw the introduction of Blizzard's very own Overwatch, which in its initial year earned $1 billion between the sales of the game and in-game loot box transactions. In a statement to that fact, Activision Blizzard CEO Bobby Kotick specifically credited Overwatch for a 25% increase of in-game sales that year. Activision's implementation was even applauded by Forbes' Paul Tassi. The fact remains that if loot boxes are going to exist, they should probably emulate the Overwatch model. However, all that goodwill quickly changed later that same year, when loot boxes finally returned to China. The rampant use of loot box or loot box systems caused China's government to crack down on the system, and when loot boxes came back to China, these companies had to disclose the drop rates for their content. And because of this, it was revealed that Overwatch crates are designed so the players will receive a legendary item after opening 13.5 crates. Now, while Tassi may be right that Overwatch only adds cosmetics, there are multiple types, with skins being the most desirable, but any of the collectibles can fall under this moniker of legendary. Not to mention, crates can only be bought in bundles of 11, 24 and 50, costing 10, 20 and 40 respectively. In the same year, Valve also had to disclose drop rates for CSGO loot, and according to Reddit user Hansjik, the highest rarity of yellow has a 0.26% rate to drop, with second rarest having a 0.6% of dropping. I think it's also noteworthy that Hansjik was basing all his calculations on opening 125.12 cases. This all proved to be just a bit too much for a lot of people, and at this point, lawmakers in the US started to get involved. involved. After all, the 3 biggest offenders were all American companies. In Hawaii, 4 bills were introduced to set rules for gaming in regards to loot box and microtransactions. In response to this, Stanley Pierre Louise of the Entertainment Software Association had this to say.
Depending on the game design, some loot boxes are earned and others can be purchased. In some games, they have elements that help a player progress through the video game. In others, they are optional features and are not required to progress or succeed in the game. In both cases, the gamer makes the decision. They are not gambling.
In a report published by the British Gambling Commission in 2017, 25,000 children aged between 11 and 16 in the UK are problem gamblers, while another 36,000 are at risk of developing a problem. Now, while that report covers a plethora of gambling sources, it does note that 11% of children claim to be involved in skin betting for CSGO. And earlier that same year, 2 men had been arrested over running a FIFA betting site. And the chief executive of the UK Gambling Commission, Sarah Harrison, labelled such sites as parasites. And The Guardian also reported that cognitive psychologists have compared loot box systems to slot machines and/or roulette tables.
When you start opening a loot box, we want to build anticipation. We do this in a lot of ways: animation, camera work, spinning plates and sound. We even build a little anticipation with the glow that emits from a loot box's cracks before you open it.
That's a quote from Michael Heiberg, a developer for Overwatch, who was one of the many tasked with making the loot boxes as enticing as possible. It also sounds eerily similar to the principle of a slot machine. Now, I'm no lawyer, so I can't attest to what legally constitutes as gambling, but Ryan Morrison, the video game attorney, can, and he did.
You're putting something of value in, and you're buying something that has odds to it, that you're unaware of. You're getting something you value, or you don't. Those are factors in all 50 states.
In 2017, Kotaku interviewed Reddit user Ken's Gold, a 19-year-old gamer who spent $13,500 on video game microtransactions between 2013 and 2016, with CSGO among many of the games contributing to this issue. Ken's addiction was so bad, his family actively tried to stop him going online, and he got a second job to fuel his addiction, despite the fact he was still in high school at the time. By Ken's Gold's own admission, the problem only subsided when he sought out professional help.
I had to get the nerve to ask for help, to get a therapist to lay it out for me.
Path of Exile's player Cadence was so addicted to loot boxes in the game, they directly contacted the creators to disable the function on their account to prevent them indulging in their addiction. In fact, when Cadence was talking to The Verge about their issue, they outlined the most money they'd spent on cosmetics in a season was $400, and they didn't even get every single item.
People tend to jump on to loot boxes thinking that they'll get a deal, but that's not how gambling works. The house always wins.
I also think it's fairly insidious that both Blizzard and Valve have created auction houses for their games where items can be sold for actual money. In fact, CSGO has seen asking prices and sold for over $1,000 for in-game cosmetics. One could argue that loot boxes are even more insidious than slot machines to an extent. The Nintendo mobile game Fire Emblem Heroes has a 3% chance to drop 5-star characters. However, this rate is increased the more players consecutively pull characters. Now, while these stats are disclosed in the app, it doesn't make it any less egregious. In fact, Morrison, our video game attorney, touched on an eerily similar point.
I have seen developers change the odds of winning based on buying habits, and lowering the user's chance of winning if they know they'll buy more. Can you imagine a poker machine or a slot machine that would lower the odds of winning if they knew you would spend another hour playing? That would be illegal anywhere.
If that's not enough, a poll in the UK in 2018 found that 60% of people thought loot boxes should be regulated as gambling. But what about those that aren't problem gamers? Those that can resist the allure of loot boxes? I mean, many companies have claimed not to promote the feature. I mean, take it from an EA spokesperson.
All EA games can be played without spending on in-game items, and the majority of players do not spend.
That was a statement EA gave to CBS earlier this year. The reason being because a 54-page document was leaked, wherein EA stated, FIFA Ultimate Team is the cornerstone, and we are doing everything we can to drive players there. So, based on their own words, EA is either lying to the consumer, or everyone in the building is lying to one another. It's probably both. I think it's also very telling that not only is FIFA 2021 the lowest ranked game in the series, but even major players have begun to sour on the series, with pro players players like Boris Legend taking to Twitter to vent their frustration. An article by Dexter.com even expanded on Boris's point, finding that even if pro players conform to the mandate and pay in the $6,000, they would have to make it through both qualifiers and place 8th in the championship in order to break even. Not to mention that the grand prize for the tournament is $50,000, meaning that players are spending over a tenth of the max prize pool to remain competitively viable. And the only solution another pro player could think of was to create a tournament mode where all players are available to participants, or as non-pro players will know it, regular FIFA. Even if the company's culture aren't actively pushing players to purchase loot boxes or cosmetics, the cultures created by these items do. A Polygon article from 2018 outlined the fact kids playing Fortnite felt pressured to buy skins to not be seen as novices or labeled as defaults, a slang term now used in place instead of losers, according to one parent on Twitter. But how have things changed? Since Hawaii took action, 4 other states have also followed suit and introduced legislation to protect minors against loot boxes. In 2018, Belgium and the Netherlands classified loot boxes as gambling, and in September of 2019, the Gambling Regulators European Forum put out a statement warning about the dangers of gambling-like mechanics in games, which was signed by 15 different EU countries. And it's not just governments making changes either. Tim Sweeney, the co-founder of Epic, has condemned the practice, ostensibly accepting blame for damages done to gamers. Fortnite has even reworked its loot systems so players could preview the box's content. Ironically, while researching this video, I was informed that EA implemented a similar feature to FUT, yet they still carry boxes without the feature and advertise they have higher drop rates for rarer players. Speaking of EA, when they were brought before the English House of Commons in regards to video game addiction, EA representative Kerry Hopkins had this to say.
We do think the way we have implemented these kinds of mechanics, and FIFA of course is our big one, our FIFA Ultimate Team and our packs, is actually quite ethical and quite fun, quite enjoyable to people.
Yet according to a Radio 1 interview with games journalist Ryan Brown shortly after, no they don't. As he points out, even gamers who indulge in these systems actively don't enjoy them. Even Ken's Gold sharing his story, it's not an admonishment of EA, rather a call to action to protect others that are vulnerable like himself. Yet despite that, EA shows no sign of stopping. The FTC's initial inquest into loot boxes was postponed due to the government shutdown in 2019, and little to no headway has been made in the States because of this. EA for the most part seem to have no desire to remove these features, and why would they? They're a $1 billion earner yearly now. Ultimately, loot boxes are a sad story of a feature that could have been implemented by smaller devs to generate revenue for more ambitious projects, that now seems to be vehemently used by a market that doesn't seem to care about the well-being of its user base. That's not to say there aren't success stories, but these examples are few and far between. I think Chris Lee put it best when making his argument for Hawaii to bring in legislation against these systems all the way back in 2017.
As someone who's been an avid gamer my entire life, it's been really frustrating to see the business model for the industry begin to transition from creating and selling great products to creating products that exploit gamers.
Whew! Way to celebrate 500 subscribers, am I right? I want to thank everybody that was involved in this project, because there was a lot. Thank you to Caleb Long for giving me the idea for the script. I didn't actually realize I was going to get so much out of it. Thank you to Alex Webb for reading quotes, Hayley Roche, Dylan Burgess Grant, Marcus Rochford, Andrew Teggin, Nicole B. Sings. You're all wizards, geniuses, beautiful people. I love you. And hey, if this is your first time watching, I don't usually make stuff like this. Check out my other videos. Like, comment, subscribe, ring that bell. See you in the next one, baby. Bye!
I'm a sharpshooter. I post my skirt.